great thing about history is that it never changes. Changing history would require the invention of reverse time travel, and that would bring with it a whole host of mind-rending paradoxes that humans are better off not having to deal with. That said, our understanding of history is certainly open to change. Advancements in science and archaeology frequently result in historians having to rethink or just completely discard their previous assumptions about the way the world used to be. Whether it's giant monuments that predate cities or the discovery that seemingly abstract drawings were a full written language, our understanding of history is just constantly changing. So let's have a look at some ways that it did, shall we? The Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, for a long time, the oldest known Hebrew language manuscripts of the Bible were dated to the 10th century. This changed in 1902 with the discovery of the Nash Papyrus, which was originally dated to the 2nd century AD before being reappraised to being from the 2nd century BC. Still, the Nash Papyrus was only 24 lines long, so it didn't really give biblical scholars much to work with. With no evidence to the contrary, historians operated under two assumptions with regard to Judaism and the Bible. The first assumption was that Judaism, during the Second Temple period, from the 6th century BC to the 1st century AD, was largely a singular unified religion. The second assumption was that, much like with a game of telephone, the Bible had undergone countless changes and revisions over the 1,000 years prior to the oldest known manuscripts. That all changed in 1947 when a Bedouin shepherd tossed a rock into a cave about a mile from the Dead Sea. Muhammad Edib was traveling with his cousin and another shepherd, and for some reason he decided that he'd toss a rock in a cave. Sounds like something I would do. But rather than just hearing the sound of the rock bouncing off rock, Muhammad instead heard the unmistakable sounds of pottery shattering. They investigated the cave, and inside they found 7 scrolls stored in clay jars. So they took the scrolls along with them. After some amount of time debating on what to do with these scrolls, they took them to a nearby market where they were sold to a couple of antiques dealers. The scrolls changed hands multiple times until they eventually caught the attention of John Trevor, the American Schools of Oriental Research. After finally tracking down the original cave where the scrolls were found, excavations and further exploration resulted in the discovery of hundreds of additional manuscripts over the next 5 years. To date, 981 total manuscripts have been discovered across a dozen different caves. Many of these are small fragments, but there are multiple scrolls containing complete books of the Old Testament, with the occasional word missing from tears in the papers. These manuscripts, which range from the 3rd to the 1st century BC, became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, and their discovery completely changed the way that historians viewed biblical history. About 40% of the manuscripts were texts from the Old Testament. Another 30% were texts from the Second Temple period that were not canonized in the Hebrew Bible, and the remainder was a variety of previously unknown manuscripts from various Jewish sects. The previously unknown texts showed that Judaism during this period was not nearly as unified as it had once been believed. There were rules and customs for numerous different sects of Judaism, including apocalyptic sects that believed the end times were imminent. This was very different than what historians had previously believed, but it wasn't as surprising as the other discovery. The 2,000-year-old biblical texts found in those caves were remarkably similar to the authoritative Masoretic texts from 1,000 years ago. While they weren't identical, the majority of differences were really minor, such as different spellings of the same word, the order of the words being reversed, or the addition of conjunctions. This showed that the texts had been faithfully and meticulously copied with only minor stylistic changes, unlike the broad changes that historians assumed had existed. The end of Clovis first. Though alternative theories exist, it's widely agreed upon by historians and anthropologists that the earliest humans evolved in Africa at least a couple of million years ago. The out of Africa theory has evolved over time, but the overall conclusion that humans originated in Africa has remained the same. According to the current theory, around 1.5 million years ago, Homo erectus traveled out of Africa and evolved into other human species, most notably Neanderthals and Denisovans. Then between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, you and me, evolved in Africa. Modern humans began expanding out of Africa around 70,000 years ago, effectively replacing other human species. Note that this wasn't necessarily by exterminating other humans, as evident by the existence of Neanderthal and Denisovian DNA in present-day humans from different regions. Large groups of Homo sapiens absorbed and interbred with the small band of other humans they encountered, essentially diluting their species out of existence. Explaining how people got to Europe and Asia, that's easy as they're connected to Africa, but it still left the question of how and why people made their way to the Americas. Now, for much of the 20th century, this question was answered by the Clovis First theory. In the 1920s, archaeologists discovered remnants of an ancient civilization near Clovis in New Mexico. The artifacts were dated to about 13,000 years ago, and it was believed that this was the first civilization to populate the Americas. Further discoveries showed remnants of the Clovis culture across the United States and northern Mexico, all dated to roughly the same period, which supported the idea that these were the first humans to reach North America, and that they rapidly spread out across the continent. It was assumed that humans traveled across the Beringia land bridge that connected the Siberia and Alaska during the last glacial period, when sea levels were much lower. It was believed that they made this initial trek roughly 14,000 years ago and then traveled from Alaska to the continental United States through an ice-free corridor 500 to 1,000 years later. Note that while Alaska was somehow habitable, all of Canada was covered in a sheet of ice at the time. While it's still believed that humans first came to the Americas via this land bridge, recent discoveries have contradicted the belief that the Clovis culture were the first humans to reach the continent. In the early 2000s, new sites were discovered that were dated to significantly before the Clovis culture. The first site to reach scholarly consensus regarding its age was Monteverde in southern Chile. Radiocarbon dating put the archaeological finds between 14,500 and 18,000 years ago. And not only did this mean that people arrived in the Americas thousands of years earlier than was previously thought, but additional climate research showed that the route they took was likely different than previously believed. It's now believed that the ice-free corridor through Canada wouldn't have existed until about 1,000 years after the Clovis culture was already established across the United States. Instead, it is believed that settlers traveled along the Pacific coast of North America using routes that were only available because of the lower ocean levels. Göbekli Tepe. Now, studying prehistory sometimes does rely on some assumptions and inferences. Since it is the time before written records, historians have to rely on other evidence to learn about what the lives of people used to be like. And one big assumption that dominated history pretty much forever was that things like cities and monuments couldn't have existed before the invention of agriculture. Prehistoric humans existed in relatively small groups of nomadic or semi-nomadic hunters and gatherers, so building cities wouldn't have made a lot of sense. Sure, there may have been caves that these groups would return to at the same time every year for shelter, but building a settlement didn't make sense for people that were just going to need to travel in search of food again. Monumental structures carried with them an additional problem. Aside from not seeming like it would be a priority for nomadic tribes to build these structures, it was believed that they wouldn't have even been possible. Building monuments requires a lot of labor, far more than one group of hunter-gatherers would have had, so the only way that it would have been possible was with some sort of central leadership that could organize labor between various hunter-gatherer groups. It was also long believed that organized religion was a product of human settlements. In order for organized religion to exist, it was believed that there needed to be a permanent settlement with a surplus of goods necessary for survival. That's not to say that hunter-gatherers didn't have their own religious systems, but it was believed that they wouldn't have been able to construct temples or dedicate personnel to running a religion. All of their resources were simply necessary for survival, so dedicated specialists like priests or shamans who were not involved in the gathering of food would have simply been out of the question. Then in 1963, in the southern Anatolia region of Turkey, an archaeological survey discovered the site that's now known as Göbekli Tepe, but they didn't think very much of it at the time. It was assumed that the site was an old cemetery that didn't have any real historical or at least archaeological significance. It wasn't until 1994 that German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavations of the site after recognizing how important it was, and these excavations completely shattered those assumptions that had been made about prehistoric societies. Initially, Göbekli Tepe was believed to be a temple or a ritual center, with the oldest portions being dated to 9500 BC. All of the archaeological evidence suggested that it was the product of hunter-gatherer tribes predating the transition to sedentary agriculture. Portions of the structure are 15 meters or 50 feet tall, and it was constructed using limestone blocks, each weighing tons. While there is no agreement on exactly how many people would have been required to build Göbekli Tepe or how long it would take, it was certainly a multi-year project that would have required collaboration between multiple hunter-gatherer tribes. Excavations of the site continued after Schmidt's death in 2014, and recent findings have shown that Göbekli Tepe likely wasn't just a religious monument, but it was a permanent or semi-permanent settlement, albeit for a relatively small population. Tools for processing grain, such as mortars and pestles, were found within the settlement, suggesting that the residents spent a good deal of time processing cereal grains. It is well established that there is a link between agriculture and permanent settlements, though there is a lot of debate among historians over which one of those caused the other. However, it was assumed that organized religion and monument building were the result of settlements. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe suggests that organized religion and collaborative building projects may have come first, potentially making them the impetus for humans settling down rather than a byproduct of it. The Rosetta Stone. In 1798, Napoleon began the French invasion of Egypt and Syria. In July of 1799, the French took over an old and broken-down fort that had been built hundreds of years earlier by the Mamluks. They began renovating the fort so that it would once again be suitable for defense, and the renovations involved the removal of some existing walls. And when one of these walls was demolished, Lieutenant Pierre-François Bouchard noticed an inscribed stele that had been hidden behind the wall and immediately recognized its importance. The large stone contained an inscription written in 3 languages. First was Egyptian hieroglyphs, then Demotic, and then Greek. Neither Demotic nor the hieroglyphs had been successfully translated, and this was the first bilingual, or actually in this case trilingual, text ever discovered containing Egyptian hieroglyphs. Bouchard immediately notified General Jacques-François Minot of the discovery, and General Minot was in Rosetta, hence the name of the stone. He then informed Napoleon's newly created Egyptian Scientific Institute in Cairo, and the stone was transported to Cairo for examination. All that was left to do was use the trilingual text to translate the 2 previously undeciphered languages. Now, many people are aware of that much of the story, but there is an important element that is often overlooked, which is how the discovery of the Rosetta Stone disproved the centuries-old assumption that scholars have been working on. The ability to read Egyptian hieroglyphs in Demotic had fully disappeared by around the 5th century AD, with Coptic becoming the predominant written language instead. During the medieval period, there was an interest in translating the old texts, but nobody got very far. There were no bilingual scripts containing hieroglyphs before the Rosetta Stone, so they had nothing to work with there. But there were some bilingual texts containing Demotic. However, scholars believed that neither of these was a true written language, an assumption that made them borderline impossible to decipher. It was believed that ancient Egyptian writings were ideographic, meaning that the symbols represented ideas rather than sounds. While it was entertained that Demotic may have only been partially ideographic, or perhaps some unintelligible form of shorthand, hieroglyphs were assumed to be fully ideographic, which honestly makes sense, as Egyptian hieroglyphs contain things like birds, eyes, and other recognizable objects. Not only was it believed that neither of these were a true written language, but hieroglyphs were believed to have mystical qualities as well. Basically, it was thought that this was a form of pictorial storytelling, and the meaning of the images would have been contextually tied to the contemporary society, making it impossible to decipher. Demotic was translated first, but after decades of work, the hieroglyphs were also deciphered, with the decipherment being completed by Jean-François Champollion in the 1820s. And while the language did contain ideographic elements, there were phonetic symbols as well. Unlike what historians have believed for the centuries they spent trying to decipher these texts, the Rosetta Stone showed that Egyptian hieroglyphs really were a full written representation of their spoken language, not just a vague or mystical representation of ideas through pictures. Ice cores. Now, when it comes to studying prehistoric climate, we have to rely on various proxies. After all, it's not like we can travel a million years back in time and see what the weather was like. We addressed the fact that there is no time machine available earlier. Over the centuries, various different proxies have been used. Trees, for example, have been a popular proxy for studying past climate, particularly local climate. Differences in tree rings can give indications about factors like temperature and rainfall from year to year. Ocean sediment has also been a useful tool. Using various proxies, scientists were able to construct a lot of information about Earth's past climate. Geologic and biologic materials can even tell us what the climate was like tens of millions or even billions of years ago. That's how we know what the Earth was like back when the dinosaurs were alive. However, these proxies they're not without their limitations. There was a lot we knew about Earth's previous climate, like there were multiple ice ages and major volcanic events that shaped the Earth's climate. While there was plenty of evidence of these things, it was hard to pin down exact dates. Scientists had a vague idea of when these things happened, but there was a limit on how exact the estimates could be. This changed in the second half of the 20th century, thanks to research into ice cores. Ice cores are just large cylinders of ice drilled out of glaciers, usually in Greenland or Antarctica. In these areas, the snow doesn't melt, so layer upon layer of snow piles up, gets compressed down into ice, and leaves an exact record of what the Earth's climate was like. Not only does the snow carry particles and debris from the atmosphere down to the ground, allowing us to pinpoint specifically when things like major volcanic activity occurred, there are also tiny air bubbles trapped in the ice. These air bubbles are pockets of air trapped in time for potentially millions of years, allowing us to measure exactly what the atmospheric conditions were like. The oldest ice core goes back 2.7 million years, though that particular ice was forced closer to the surface by geological processes. Usually, obtaining ice cores involves drilling deep into glaciers as deep as 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers. In 2025, the largest continuous ice core was pulled from Antarctica by drilling 1.7 miles down into an Antarctic glacier, showing climate data for 1.2 million years. Now, much of what has been learned from ice cores has just been an increase in precision from other proxies that we used. By measuring levels of different gases found in the air bubbles, scientists also confirmed a strong correlation between the global temperature and the levels of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere. On a somewhat concerning note, they also found that the current levels of methane and CO2 are at a record high over the last 800,000 years. But there was one discovery from the ice cores that flew in the face of conventional wisdom. It is known that there have been variations in Earth's temperature, including multiple ice ages. These appeared to be somewhat cyclical in nature, linked to the Earth's position relative to the Sun. These cycles are called Milankovitch cycles, and they're named after Serbian scientist Milutin Milanovic, and it was always assumed that the resulting temperature changes were very gradual over the course of tens of thousands of years. However, the ice cores told a different story. It took 10,000 years for the Earth to emerge from the last ice age, and as we said, it was always assumed that this was a very gradual change over that period. Examining the ice cores from Greenland showed that, in actuality, the temperature increased by 15 degrees Fahrenheit in a single decade, accounting for up to 50% of the entire change in temperature as the ice age ended. While there are a couple of theories on why this happened, including increased levels of greenhouse gases, the new evidence showed that Earth's global climate doesn't just change slowly over time. It is also susceptible to very extreme changes in small periods of time. Amazonian LiDAR scans. As we alluded to earlier, humans have been in South America for at least 15,000 years. The oldest known urban centers date back to Peru roughly 5,000 years ago, and it's long been known that there were civilizations in the mountains along the coast. But the Amazon was a different story. Historians believe that the Amazon River basin wasn't capable of supporting any sort of widespread society with a large population. Part of this was because of the Eurocentric view of researchers who assumed that pre-Columbian inhabitants of South America would have been too primitive and lacked the tools and skills to build cities in the Amazon. Even disregarding that bias, though, the Amazon is notoriously inhospitable to agriculture. The soil is highly acidic and low in nutrients, resulting in poor conditions for farming. Widespread belief among historians was that while there were people living in the Amazon, they were small bands of hunter-gatherers or slash-and-burn farmers. There was no large civilization. This belief began to change, starting in the 1960s, with the discovery of settlements from the Kasarabe culture scattered around the Amazon. Hundreds of settlements were found through the Llanos de Moxos region, but it was unclear whether or not these were actually connected. Unfortunately, the dense Amazon forest made it difficult to study the region, and nothing could be seen from above because of the tree cover. But in 2022, this changed thanks to the use of LiDAR, which is kind of like radar, but using light from lasers instead of radio waves. LiDAR scans are able to map and image the ground despite the tree cover with remarkable detail. These scans showed that the settlements of the Kasarabe culture were all connected, meaning there was a large civilization living in the Amazon as far back as 500 AD. That was already a major change to what historians had previously believed, but an even bigger discovery was made in 2025. Additional LiDAR scans in Ecuador's Apano Valley revealed a complex urban civilization that was dated as being at least 2,500 years old, if not older. That's 1,000 years older than the Kasarabe culture, a civilization that had already been thought to be impossible. The use of LiDAR is completely revolutionary revolutionized our understanding of ancient civilizations in the Amazon, and with these discoveries being so recent, there is undoubtedly going to be even more discovered. Viking sunstones. Now, by this point, most people know that Vikings visited North America hundreds of years before Columbus made his famous voyage. While that is well established at this point, it did leave one unanswered question. How'd they get there? Now, obviously, the answer is with boats, but there is more to it than that. You see, the magnetic compass was invented in China sometime during the Han Dynasty, probably in the 2nd century BC. It eventually made its way to the Islamic world and from there to Europe, but this didn't happen until the 1100s, over a century after the Vikings visited North America. Without magnetic compasses to use as a navigation tool, the main way for ships to navigate was by using the position of the sun. Ships could also use landmarks if they were sailing along a coast, but Greenland isn't visible from Iceland, despite the common myth, and Canada wouldn't have been visible from the southern parts of Greenland that the Vikings settled in. This meant that when they left Iceland and subsequently left Greenland, there was no way to know what was out there and no way to navigate west other than the sun, or at night with the stars. While the sun is an accurate way for ships to find their bearings, the voyage from Greenland to Canada would have taken them about a week in ideal sailing conditions and potentially longer. And over the course of a full week, at some point it's probably going to be cloudy. That's a major problem for ships that have to rely on the sun for navigation, as an overcast day could result in ships veering dangerously off course. According to the Norse sagas, Vikings were able to navigate on cloudy days or when the sun was below the horizon through the use of sunstones. However, the existence and usage of sunstones was believed to be a myth, as no such stones had ever been found in a Viking shipwreck. But a discovery in 2002 showed that sunstones may have been a real thing. In the wreck of a 16th century warship found off the coast of Alderney, a stone was found alongside a compass. That stone was a piece of Iceland spar, a form of calcite known for its polarizing effects on light. Although compasses were already being widely used, it's speculated that this may have been a sunstone that was brought along as a backup navigational tool, as older compasses would sometimes malfunction, especially when ships sailed nearer to the magnetic pole. In 2011, a research team led by Guy Ropas decided to test whether Iceland's spar would work to accurately locate the sun on a cloudy day. According to their paper, they were able to find the position of the sun with incredible accuracy, both when it was cloudy and when the sun was just below the horizon. While this is potentially a remarkable discovery, the verdict is still out on its accuracy. An attempt to replicate Ropas' experiment failed, though he argued that the subsequent researchers just might not have practiced enough with the stone beforehand to get the hang of it. It's also been argued that sunstones can't have been real since none were ever found in a Viking shipwreck. One of the co-authors of Ropas' paper countered this by stating that calcite degrades relatively quickly, especially in seawater. Iceland spar is usually transparent, but the Alderney crystal was a milky white. That shipwreck was a good 500 years more recent than any Viking shipwrecks have been, so it's not impossible to suggest that Iceland spar would fully degrade given the additional centuries exposed to seawater. So even though we can't say for certain yet that sunstones were more than just a Norse legend, they have moved from being a myth to at least being plausible. If another research team can recreate the results of the 2011 experiment, it may prove that the Vikings really did navigate through the use of these sunstones. The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. The start of the medieval period is marked by the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, leading to a loss of classical texts in the West that has often disparagingly been referred to as the Dark Ages. One of the big reasons that many classical texts disappeared was that few people could read Greek anymore. The simplified version is that people in the Roman Empire spoke Latin, and educated people learned Greek as well. As such, there was never a need to translate classical Greek texts into Latin, as anyone educated enough to read Aristotle would be able to read Greek anyway. With the collapse of the empire, people now predominantly spoke regional languages, with Latin being the language spoken by the educated. There were other factors as well, such as papyrus texts degrading over time and the selective reproduction of classical works for various reasons, but the massive decline in people who could understand Greek was one of the biggest factors. Fortunately, many of these texts lived on in the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, where they were translated to Arabic. These texts then made their way back to Western Europe during the late medieval period and the Renaissance. However, In the interim was the Islamic Golden Age, which saw massive advancements in science, philosophy, mathematics, and more. But the Europeans weren't particularly interested in that. They only cared about the work of their ancestors, viewing the further work from the Islamic world as being just derivations from the original Greek works. There was a widespread disparagement of Arabic and Islamic culture, with many prominent figures seeking to remove any of the work of Arabic origin. Because of that, the Western world was almost entirely unaware of the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices by Ismail al-Jazari. Al-Jazari had worked as the chief engineer at Artuklu Palace in modern-day Diyarbakir in Turkey. He was an incredibly accomplished polymath, scholar, inventor, and most importantly, mechanical engineer. His book contained drawings of over 50 of his mechanical inventions with detailed instructions on how to construct them. Although his inventions were primarily intended to be practical machines, al-Jazari focused heavily on aesthetics as well. Among his most famous inventions was a water clock known as the elephant clock. It was the first clock in which an automaton reacted after certain intervals of time, in this case every 30 minutes. Basically, it was the original cuckoo clock. These incredible inventions remained unknown to Western audiences until the book began being translated into European languages in the late 19th century. It wasn't translated into English until 1973. Before Western audiences finally had translations of al-Jazari's book, it was believed that the first programmable automaton was the writer, created by the Jacques A. Joz family. It was one of 3 automata that they made, but the writer was unique in that it could be programmed by the user. The robot, which was designed as a boy holding a quill, could be programmed to write any message up to 40 characters long. It was a remarkable piece of engineering for 1774, but it turned out that it wasn't the first. In al-Jazari's book from 1206, one of his designs was for a band of musical robots used to entertain guests at drinking parties. 3 of the 4 robots would always play the same music, but the rhythm played by the drummer could be programmed by the user, beating out the writer as the first programmable automaton by over 500 years. Ever since his work finally became known to Western audiences, al-Jazari has become known as the father of robotics. Birka grave BJ581. When Swedish archaeologist Hjalmar Stolpe first discovered the grave he labelled BJ581 in Birka in Sweden, he described it as perhaps the most remarkable of all the graves in this field. Birka was a major trading centre for the Vikings, and it is one of the most important Viking archaeological sites. Stolpe began his excavations in the 1870s, with the aforementioned grave being excavated in 1878 and labelled as BJ581 in 1889. The grave was on an elevated terrace directly touching the garrison, and it was marked by a large boulder. Inside the grave was a wooden burial chamber containing the bones of the deceased, the skeletal remains of 2 horses, numerous weapons including a sword, axe, spear, and armor-piercing arrows, and a 28-piece gaming set with an iron game board and 3 dice. The combination of the weapons and the gaming set suggested that this was a high-ranking Viking warrior with a deep knowledge of tactics and strategy. Since this was clearly a warrior's grave and a particularly important warrior, Stolpe identified the skeleton as being male. This assumption went unchallenged for nearly 140 years. After all, people assumed that not just Viking warriors, but nearly all warriors were men, and who was Stolpe to argue with established history? Sure, there was Freya, the Viking goddess of war, Odin's Valkyries, and all sorts of art that seemed to show a roughly even split between Viking warriors being depicted as both male and female, but none of that was important. The tales of female Viking warriors were largely disregarded as myths and legends, though some accounts spoke of Viking women being used to defend homesteads. Still, those stories were regarded as being from unreliable sources. In the 1970s, an osteological analysis was performed that identified the skeleton as belonging to a woman, though these findings were dismissed. Even the osteological analysis that existed when Stolpe first discovered the grave would have identified it as female remains, and anyone bothered to investigate instead of just assuming it was a dude. It wasn't until 2017 that DNA analysis using samples from a tooth and an arm bone definitively proved that the bones were female. This not only proved Stolpe's original assessment of the grave belonging to a high-ranking male warrior incorrect, but it called into question all of the assumptions regarding Viking warrior women being purely fictional creations. Unfortunately, many critics have pushed back on the discovery, using arguments that seem to defy reason and logic. It has been argued that just because all that stuff was buried in the same grave as this woman, it should not be taken as proof that they were her possessions. Some have gone so far as to say that the grave may have been disturbed by a mischievous reverse grave robber, an individual who filled the grave with things that the woman hadn't actually been buried with. Right. A less outlandish theory is that women, such as those in BJ 581, may have been able to be high-ranking Viking officers without actually engaging in combat. And all of this begs a couple of questions. First, why are historians so dismissive of the idea that female warriors might have existed? And second, if female warriors didn't exist, why are Freya, Athena, and Sekhmet just 3 examples out of the dozens of war goddesses that existed in mythologies across the world? Thank you for watching.